I tell you, the new generation um, of hoopers, they get a lot of criticism and a lot of things said about them. But the one thing I will say is we're to the generation where because the NBA embraced social media, because the NBA post David Stern let their players have a voice, this generation wants to hear directly from the players. And I'm not mad at them. I mean, whether it's Gilbert Arenas, Jeff Teague, Paul Pierce, and Kevin Garnett, Draymond, I can go on and on and on. Playoff P of guys who have their own podcast. JJ Redick. JJ Redick is real good. I can understand why the kids of today, they want to listen to that, man. They want to hear from the hoopers. Now, when I was growing up and I was the same age, you heard from a newspaper guy. Not even a radio guy, because even then, sports radio wasn't that big when I was a kid. You knew about the ones in New York and those guys, but for the most part, it's newspaper guys. Then ESPN had a thing called the Sports Reporters, which was a series of newspaper guys. Bob Ryan from the Boston Globe, and William C. Roden, Ralph Wiley, may he rest in peace. Those guys. But today, kids, because they have grown up listening to what players say directly from the player. And I know there are people in my generation who hate that. I mean, absolutely hate that. No, they wanted to be a newspaper guy and they want to tell people what you should think about the individual. And they want to impose what they think is integrity. Who's a good guy? Who's a bad guy? And they don't want the kids of today to say, hey, man, I like that dude. This is where I heard from him. I like that guy. And, when you look at some of the industries and you look at how some people still convey information or content, however you want to say it, they still think that there's a user community or consumer or however you want to put it that needs for you to tell them what to think and what integrity looks like and what character looks like. Oh, and it's all unbiased. It has nothing to do with the writer's agenda, right? And these kids today don't have to do it, and God bless them, because this is kind of when I watched these podcasts and stuff like that. Man, I wish growing up that with the characters that was in the NBA when I was watching it, I would have loved to have had them have a podcast. Can you see Gary Payton having a podcast? Could you see Charles Barkley, if he was still active, especially in those Philadelphia games, having a podcast? Could you see if someone tried to put Moses Malone on a podcast? Oh my gosh, what sort of stuff you would have gotten? Oh man, you could have the Bill Lambier podcast that people would swear that they don't listen to because Bill's a jerk, but then he'd have great ratings, and he'd have Isaiah on. Then, obviously the worst podcast would have to be, something like John Stockton and Karl Malone. I guess my point is that hearing there is something refreshing from hearing directly from the player and letting you enjoy the player or maybe not enjoy the player, but having it come just free of someone else's agenda. So I say this for the NBA because it's the NBA that's most prominent with it. And they were really the first sports that really allowed their players or knew that there was nothing they could do about their players expressing themselves. And on top of that, because there's no helmet to hide your face and stuff. I mean, you know who these guys are. Plus, the NBA consumer, especially the younger ones, and especially the consumers of color, which often get forgotten, bro, that's who they want to hear from. This is no offense to Bill Simmons, and Zach Lowe and those guys, because those guys have really good podcasts. And I do occasionally listen to those guys too. Brian Windhorst, love his podcast there with the guys they have with Bon Temps and those guys on it. But there's something refreshing from hearing directly from the player. And I can understand why this generation why they want to hear directly from the player and just take out all of the agenda-driven nonsense that when sports talk radio came to fruition and became more and more popular in a lot of cities, the voice was monotone, very singular to say the least. And, I have no problem with the players saying, you know what, I think I want to take control of my brand. And that's awesome to see. So kudos to the NBA and the NBA players, both present and former.